In April of 1985, a Montana man is working multiple jobs to save money and pursue his dreams. After getting off of one job, he went straight to his second job to deliver pizzas. As he approached a regular-looking house for delivery, he would have no idea that he was walking into a trap. His own brother would be the first responder who showed up to the house, a scene that has never left him. The investigation produced many suspects, some wrong turns, and closed in closely on a violent repeat offender. But nobody has ever been arrested for this calculated crime, and investigators believe it's highly likely that more than one person was involved or knows information. More than 40 years later, it could take just one small clue or person coming forward to solve this case. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Morris Davis Jr. Thanks everyone for joining me again for another week. I encountered the case I'm going to tell you about today when researching another Montana case brought to me by a listener, one that will be a future episode. When I dug into it, I was just floored at just how premeditated this crime was and how senseless the violence was that occurred. A murder seemingly over pizza money. Morris's family has pushed for answers in this case for decades. His mother has stayed put in Montana, and they have lived their lives with a huge piece missing. In a recent interview with a local news station, Morris's elderly mother was asked what answers would mean to her in her son's case, and she replied that it would be everything. That's all I had to hear to know I had to tell listeners about Morris's case so that you all can do your thing, share it, and hopefully it lands with the right person. To shed light on some of the theories of Morris's case, it will require me to discuss some other cases and jump around a little bit, so bear with me. Lastly, I want to highlight the Great Falls Tribune as a strong source for this episode, and I've linked the old newspaper clippings and all source material in the show notes. As a quick heads up, a little later in this episode, there is brief mention of sexual violence towards a minor. And other than that, with that, let's get into it. To tell you about today's case, I'm going to take you to Great Falls, Montana, which sits along the Missouri River in the north central part of the state, surrounded by wide open prairie and some of the most expansive views of the American West. Often called the Electric City, Great Falls is known for the series of waterfalls that give the city its name, and for the hydroelectric dams that helped power its growth. The city is also tied closely to the Lewis and Clark expedition, whose members were forced to spend weeks carrying their boats and supplies around the falls in 1805. For decades, Great Falls has been a gathering point for the surrounding farming and ranching communities, with wheat fields and cattle ranches stretching for miles beyond the city limits. It's also home to nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base, which has played an important role in the nation's nuclear defense system for generations. While it is one of Montana's larger cities, Great Falls still retains that feel of a close-knit community where people know their neighbors, choose to raise their families, and where the outdoors is never too far away. One family that called Great Falls home was the Davis family. The household consisted of Morris and Delnita Davis and their two sons, Morris Jr. and Clifford. Originally from Baker County, Florida, Morris Sr. spent 12 years serving in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base. After his military service, he and Delnita decided to put down roots in Great Falls and raise their family there. Morris Jr. was born on February 22nd, 1962, and a few years later, the family welcomed another son, Clifford. Together, they lived in a modest, cozy home and built a life in the community they had chosen to call home. Montana was a perfect place for this family. They loved to hunt, fish, enjoyed the outdoors. His mother, Delnita, recalled how he once put together a muzzle loader himself, and still he got a deer with his one shot on opening day. Hunting was something that Morris Jr. and his brother Cliff did a lot together growing up, and as they grew into early adulthood. Morris Jr. was a lot like his father in that if he wasn't enjoying the outdoors, you could find him tinkering with things. And he was no amateur. He was considered a gifted mechanic who could fix just about anything you put in front of him. Beyond that, he was very into car racing, and he hoped that one day he could have his own car to fix up and race in Indianapolis. In the meantime, he worked on the pit crew at the Great Falls Speedway and spent much of his spare time fixing up his truck, a red 1958 Ford pickup truck. He had recently put a new engine and fancy wheels on the truck, and he was hoping to use his tax refund to start restoring the body. Work in progress as it was, Morris still loved taking it for long drives with his second love riding in the passenger seat. And no, I'm not talking about a girlfriend. He was a dog dad to his golden retriever that he had gotten 4 years prior as a puppy. He named her Missouri River Sunshine, and he would call her Shiner for short. Shiner was a loyal pup to her dad and would accompany him for his long rides just about anywhere, including his favorite fishing spot where a local farmer let him fish on his property. It was part of a body of water called Alice Creek, a 16-mile upper tributary of the Blackfoot River. He always had amazing luck there, catching brook trout on a worm-baited hook. Nothing fancy, just the simple life. And revisiting the dating scene for a moment, he didn't have any girlfriends at that time, but he loved to dance and had a couple of jitterbug partners. He also loved to go to the rodeo, he almost never missed them, and also ski, ice skate, and play ice hockey. One of his friends laughed and recalled how he had a really unique posture when he skied and how he would kind of squat down and have his arms straight out, which, hey, whatever works for him. I'm telling you, it's better than my skiing posture. I'll give you that. Morris had graduated from Great Falls High School and gotten a job at a place called Bison Ford out of high school. Work there had really died down. Some reports say he had been laid off, but in recent interviews, his mom mentioned he was still working there. In fact, he had worked there that day. So I'm not sure if the timelines got mixed up or if maybe it's just a mixture of multiple things. I mean, it has been 40 years and all. So I think it could be just that he wasn't working there as regularly. At 6'2" and 240 pounds, Morris was a big guy, and so a couple of local bar establishments had also hired him on part-time as a bouncer. And to keep saving money, he also worked at a place called Howard's Pizza. It's a pizza joint that is still around to this day. On April 5th, 1985, Morris had hoped to get out of his evening shift delivering pizzas so that he could go to a bachelor party of a friend being held at a popular bar in town called the Merry-Go-Round. Unfortunately, that wasn't in the cards. The pizza place was already busy enough on Fridays, but this was Good Friday, and a lot of people were ordering pizza and avoiding cooking in preparation for the large amounts they'd have to do that weekend for Easter Sunday. And in preparation, they had many people working that night and a lot of people out driving and delivering pizzas. At 9 p.m., Howard's Pizza had an order come in for 1015 6th Avenue Northwest. The pizza was thrown together, and at 9:20 p.m., Morris walked up to the house. One thing that differentiated something like pizza delivery back then from best practices of current days is that it wasn't uncommon for the delivery person to come in your home. Nowadays, we order and even tip online and pay, so sometimes the pizza can even just be left outside of your door, especially in this post-COVID world. But in the 80s and 90s, people were paying with cash and oftentimes needing change. So they might say, hey, come in, set this on the table, and then the money exchange would happen. When a significant amount of time passed and Morris hadn't returned with the company pizza truck nor radioed in an update, the company sent a second delivery worker out to his last known address to check on him. There are a couple of different reports here. Some say that the driver felt uncomfortable as he pulled up to the scene and drove back to the pizza shop and called police. Other reports say he found Morris laying there inside the sliding glass door and that he radioed for help to the pizza shop, who then called 911. Either way, we know it was from the pizza shop that 911 was called at 9:56 p.m. Police arrived before paramedics, and the first person on scene was an officer from Great Falls PD named Chris Hickman. He was the same age as the man who was in a pool of blood in front of him. He quick checked for a pulse and then cleared the other rooms because he was concerned that the criminals behind this may still be in the house. Approaching the house along with his partner was 21-year-old EMT Cliff Davis. They had gotten word that they were responding to a shooting victim, his first ever, and he felt a mixture of feelings, that nervousness and adrenaline to jump in and put his training to use. As they approached, he saw police lights and people moving in all sorts of different directions and taking action. As they approached the house, he noticed the pizza delivery truck, but nothing registered to him. That was until he saw a pair of cowboy boots in the doorframe. Cliff would say that this wasn't unusual in Montana. However, he immediately recognized them as cowboy boots that he had purchased as a Christmas present just a few months ago for his big brother. As reality set in, Cliff began to scream, "That's Morris." I want you guys to just sit for a moment with the horror of that. You're working as a first responder and you stumble into your own brother's homicide. I can't even imagine. The police officer and other EMS worker tried to work on Morris, but they knew it was too late. Rather than call in the coroner and perhaps to try to soften it for Cliff to give him some kind of hope, they rushed Morris off to Columbus Hospital. But of course, there was nothing they could do. Morris Davis Jr. was pronounced dead just after 11 p.m. Morris Sr. and Delnita had been out late to dinner, and when they got home, they got the call and rushed to the hospital. Delnita told the Daily Tribune in an open letter that this is what happened next. Quote, "When I walked into the emergency room, Cliff came screaming out of a room, running toward me, stating, 'They shot him. They killed him. I don't know why they had to shoot him so many times.' This is how I found out my oldest son was dead. Morris Jr. was just 23 years old at the time." End quote. Just like my heart broke for Cliff, it does picturing Morris Sr. and Delnita in this moment as well. Morris Davis Jr. had suffered a brutal ambush. Detectives investigating the scene pieced together clues that painted a chilling picture. You see, the home that Morris Davis delivered pizza to that night was a vacant house, a foreclosure that had a for sale sign out in front, except it didn't. One of the things that Cliff Davis noticed when entering the home was a dirty for sale sign set to the side. Police believe that whoever did this removed the for sale sign from out front, forced their way into the back door, and turned on a light so that the home would appear occupied. They then placed the call from somewhere, we don't know where because the house did not have a phone at the time, and then waited for the delivery person to arrive. The motive here appeared pretty clear. It was robbery. The wallet Morris carried on him for the pizza deliveries that night was taken, though his personal wallet, as well as his coin changer, were still on him. Through tracking orders and receipts, it's estimated that Morris Davis Jr. was killed for less than $300. Morris had been shot 8 times, once in the face, 4 times in the chest, and then once in his right wrist, upper stomach, and left rib cage. Several .22 caliber casings were found and collected for evidence. Retired Sergeant John Cameron, who worked at the department at the time of Morris Davis's murder and later became the lead investigator, told KTVH News that Morris was shot upon entering the home, and then he turned around to run and was shot further. The assailant or assailants then dragged him back into the home and executed him. So this was just really brutal. I'll have a photo of the house and the street on our Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod. Though some of the early news reports were kind of conflicting. For example, a representative of Crime Stoppers said that there were no witnesses on this residential city street, though news reports said that people saw the pizza truck and Morris standing on the front porch at 9:20. And apparently there was a party going on next door. What kind of party? Unsure. I don't know if it was a type of party that had drinking and drug use or if it was more like a family get-together. Police spent the early days canvassing the neighborhood and going through the area trash cans just looking for clues. But no matter what, the one thing that was consistent across all reports was that nobody saw anyone break into the back of the vacant residence or shoot Morris Davis. The early days of the investigation under the lead detective, Joe McGuire, brought in tons of leads and tips, but most of them didn't really amount to anything. Lieutenant Bruce Hall told the paper, quote, "We've got facts, like the ejected .22 cartridges, but no leads that direct toward a particular person," end quote. Delnita Davis was in shock those first few days. She told the Great Falls Tribune that she put together a scrapbook in preparation for Morris's funeral, photographing his truck, organizing his Boy Scout awards, pulling together family vacation photos, and reminiscing over Little League photos. And poor Missouri River Sunshine. She would walk out of the house and just stare at Morris's red truck, longing for her owner and companion, wondering when he was coming home and they were going for their next scenic ride together. Morris Davis Sr. was grieving in his own way, and that meant thinking through any of the ways they could catch his son's killer. He knew that when responders arrived, the light in the basement had been turned on. Was it one of those pull-down switch lights, and could there be fingerprints on that? What about the coin changer? When he felt he wasn't getting anywhere, he contacted the FBI. The vacant home was a VA foreclosure, and the Veterans Administration had repossessed the home. On the window, there was a sticker that basically said, if you trespass on this property or damage it, you'll be investigated by the FBI. That was either apparently smoke and mirrors or staging the home to appear occupied. Breaking in and then gunning down the pizza delivery guy didn't meet that criteria because they told Morris Davis Sr. that they didn't have any jurisdiction and they had to be invited in by law enforcement for assistance. And at that point, they were not. Around this time, pizza shops began taking new precautions to protect their drivers. Some were calling back to verify orders before sending out a delivery person. Part of this is that they theorized that the person who called for the Morris Davis case was calling from a payphone. So by calling the phone number back that was provided and verifying the order, they felt they could somewhat eliminate people who were putting in false orders or at least reduce them. They also began requiring drivers to come back and put money in a safe so they didn't have a lot of cash on them. And they went on TV publicly announcing that drivers wouldn't have a lot of cash on them. Some pizza shops doubled up on drivers to go out for delivery, and shops told drivers that if they felt uncomfortable, they could request somebody meet them outside. Like many precautions, these didn't all last forever, though some of them stuck, and with good reason, because there had been some concerning crimes happening. 3 hours north of Great Falls in Bozeman, there had been a murder of a Pizza Hut worker right at the restaurant. And then remember the bar I was telling you about, the one that the bachelor party was being held at called the Merry-Go-Round? Well, just a few weeks before Morris Davis's murder, the owner of the Merry-Go-Round was attacked at the bar before business hours, and when he would typically take the previous night's money to the bank. So the assailant shot him in the shoulder during the struggle that they had, and he made off with cash. Luckily, the owner survived, but it would end up being an above average year for violence in Great Falls. But more on that in a bit. Evidence from the scene was sent off to the state crime lab in Missoula for testing, but in 1985, that was pretty limited. In September, 5 months after the murders, the arrest of a wanted man from Idaho gave the case a fresh spark for a moment when he implicated himself in Morris Davis Jr.'s homicide. However, as they looked more into his movements, they realized that he was not there in the area during April of 85 and could not be involved, so that was a dead end. In the fall of 85, police asked for assistance from the FBI in developing a profile of the killer. After reviewing the case file, they stated that the perpetrator or perpetrators likely did not have personal beef with Morris Davis Jr. They planned to rob whichever driver showed up that night, especially since there were so many out and about. They felt that the reason for the overkill is that they wanted to ensure that he was dead because either they did not wear any masks or it's possible that Morris could have identified them and that he might actually have known them. As 1985 came to an end, they were no closer to arresting a suspect, and the city of Great Falls had one of its worst years yet for murder. You may remember that Morris's shooting was the first shooting Cliff had ever responded to, and in the end, the year would end with 7 homicides for their 55,000-person city. 3 of those were members of the same family, the McKay family, and they were murdered by a burglar, one who wasn't seemingly connected to this case. A different type of gun was used, and a teenager was charged and found guilty in that crime. 1986 would not repeat those numbers. The next and only murder in 1986 would be in October, and this one I'm going to get into because of its potential connection to Morris Davis Jr. On October 6, 1986, college student Suzette Pritchard was working her first solo shift at a gas station at one of the busiest intersections in Great Falls. It was called Keithstown Pump. Suzette was a triplet who came from a religious family and who was going to school to become a religious ed teacher. She was working at the gas station to make some extra money. She would be working a double that night, the evening shift into the overnight, and both were shifts she hadn't been scheduled for. For the evening shift, she offered to take it for a person who had just purchased a new car, and they wanted to take it for like a long road trip or drive around, something like that. And then she was supposed to be relieved for the overnight, but that person called in sick, so Suzette told the owners she could just stay. Her friends weren't super comfortable with her being a woman working alone, and so they actually visited her that evening. Friends and family stopped in to check on her, including her sister Annette Pritchard and friends Becky Hill and Vicki Kuhn. Just before 1 a.m., the 3 women left the town pump to grab Suzette some French fries from a nearby Burger King. It was a quick trip, and they were only gone for a matter of minutes. But when they returned, something immediately caught their attention. Parked behind the town pump was a maroon-colored car that none of them remembered seeing before. They described it as an older vehicle that looked rough around the edges. It was dirty, somewhat beat up, and seemed out of place enough that they noticed it right away. Vicki volunteered to take the fries inside. As she walked into the store, she saw a man standing near the microwave. He wasn't someone she recognized. As she approached, the man walked toward her and stopped only a few feet away. Vicki later said he appeared as though he may have been intoxicated. More than anything, though, she remembered just the feeling he gave her. Something about the encounter made her uncomfortable. She tried making small talk, but the interaction left her uneasy. Becky and Annette also got a look at the man, and all 3 women would later provide investigators with similar descriptions of him. When Vicki returned to the car, she didn't keep her concerns to herself. She told Annette and Becky that the man had given her the creeps. Becky had a similar impression. She felt like he was simply waiting for them to leave. The feeling was strong enough that Annette became concerned for her sister, and as they drove away from the town pump around 1:08, they had happened to look at the clock. She decided she would continue checking in on Suzette by phone for the rest of the shift. Just minutes later, another witness would report seeing a vehicle that sounded remarkably similar. Around 1:20 a.m., a local security company owner named Larry Blanchard drove past the town pump and observed a dirty red mid-sized car with visible body damage leaving from behind the store. Meanwhile, after dropping Becky and Annette off, Vicky and her boyfriend decided to swing back to the town pump to visit Suzette one more time. But this time when they arrived, something was terribly wrong. Instead of finding Suzette behind the register, Vicky found her lying on the floor behind the counter. Police were dispatched at 1:22 a.m., but by the time officers arrived, Suzette was already gone. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. As investigators processed the scene, they found a still warm, wrapped sandwich sitting on the counter. The store owner would later determine that the final transaction completed before the murder was a 99-cent sale, matching the price of that sandwich. Unfortunately, any fingerprints recovered from the wrapper were unusable. Investigators also learned that approximately $300 were missing from the store. Then, about a week later, the owner realized something else was gone, a knife with a 5-inch steel blade that had always been kept inside the town pump. In the weeks and months that followed, detectives worked tirelessly to identify the man seen in the store that night. Vicky and Becky assisted in creating composite sketches, and Annette, Becky, and Vicky sat through roughly 50 separate photo lineups. Police chased down tips from the public and explored multiple leads, including looking into another town pump employee named Joseph. Ultimately, investigators concluded he was not involved. Despite all the effort, the man who made these women uneasy that night remained unidentified, and Suzette's killer remained at large. This wasn't mentioned publicly at the time, but people began making some connections between Morris's case and Suzette's. Both murders happened while they were working. Robbery appeared to be the motive, as I should mention that Suzette had no sign of sexual assault. And the murders included quite a bit of overkill. Both cases had an incredible amount of public interest, but no viable suspects. The relationship between the Davis family and law enforcement grew tense. At one point, Delnita said that the Great Falls police couldn't catch a killer if they were standing in front of them. Great Falls PD assured her that they were doing everything they could and that overall they had a great track record of solving homicides. But at the end of the day, they hadn't solved the one that meant the most to Delnita, and she was having to grieve the loss of her son without justice. Delnita and Morris Sr. also felt that law enforcement was keeping information from them, which is, of course, a delicate balance. In cases like these, it can be important to keep certain details private for the integrity of the investigation. But on the flip side, you can't not communicate with the family, period, or they're going to feel like you aren't doing anything. It's a balance and it's very individualized. More time would pass, and then in May of '88, detectives working the case finally felt like they had the break they had been waiting for. About 180 miles from Great Falls, sheriff's deputies arrested a man who was driving a vehicle that had been reported stolen out of Oregon just days earlier. During a search, officers discovered 2 pawn shop receipts from Great Falls in his possession, and one of those receipts was for a .22 caliber handgun that had recently been pawned. That immediately caught investigators' attention. Detectives recovered the pistol from the pawn shop and quickly realized it was the same type of firearm believed to have been used in Morris's murder. The gun was sent off for forensic testing, and when the results came back, they were stunned. The bullets fired from that weapon matched the bullets recovered from the crime scene. After all those years, investigators finally had the murder weapon in their hands. At first, it looked as though they might also have their killer, but as detectives dug deeper, that quickly began to unravel. The man who pawned the gun told investigators he had stolen it from a friend in Oregon just 3 days earlier. After extensively investigating him, police ultimately cleared him of any involvement in Morris's murder. According to him, the fact that he happened to bring the murder weapon back to Great Falls nearly 3 years after the crime was nothing more than a bizarre coincidence. That explanation only shifted detectives' attention to the gun's owner, a man just referred to as Rick. When investigators contacted him, Rick insisted he had nothing to do with the homicide. He told police that at the time of Morris's murder, he had been at home caring for his infant son. According to Rick, the pistol had been stored inside a hall closet tucked between heavy blankets. He said only he and his wife knew where it was kept, which obviously his friend knew where it is too because he stole it, but that's neither here nor there. What made the situation so difficult to explain was that Rick claimed he had no idea that the gun ever left his home. Detectives spent considerable time investigating him. They interviewed him repeatedly, they administered a polygraph exam, they reviewed his background, and looked closely at his whereabouts around the time of the murder. In the end, investigators said they found no evidence linking him to the crime and no reason to believe he was involved. But while the discovery of the murder weapon answered one question, it seemed to create several more. Somehow, a gun that belonged to a man living in Oregon had been used to kill Morris in Montana. Then, according to the information available, it had apparently made its way back to Oregon and remained there for years before resurfacing in a Great Falls pawn shop. For Morris's family, particularly his brother Cliff, that explanation never quite sat right. He believed the circumstances pointed back to Rick, the gun owner. In his mind, it was difficult to understand how someone's firearm could be used in a murder hundreds of miles away without their knowledge. Rick, however, maintained that he had no idea how the gun could have left his home, used in a homicide, and somehow returned without him ever realizing it. And that's just where the mystery remained. Detectives found the murder weapon. They had traced it back to its owner, yet even with one of the most important pieces of evidence imaginable, they were still no closer to understanding exactly who pulled the trigger. Still, the gun news was big, so they had told the Davis family in May, and then they had to keep it a secret until they got all the testing results back, and then they released it to the public in November. But after that, things cooled off again for years. At first, Morris Sr. and Delnita bonded over the tragedy that took their oldest son, growing stronger and leaning into one another. But like so many families go through, their differences in grieving proved to be too much of a strain on their marriage, and they got a divorce. Delnita stayed in the family home in Montana, whereas Morris Davis Sr. moved back to Florida where he grew up and where he had more family. Detectives Steve Losey and John Cameron took over the Davis investigation in the early 90s. At this point, they couldn't make heads or tails of the gun. On paper, they had experts from 2 states saying the weapon was a match. But the story just wasn't logical, so just to cover their bases, they sent the weapon back for retesting in 95. And it was then that they got a crushing blow. The gun was actually not a match. The experts had mistakenly identified it as the murder weapon, and the real one was still out there. Delnita shared with the local papers that after that, she had a really hard time getting her hopes up for any new leads. And just shortly after this major letdown, she would be met with more grief. In 1996, Missouri River Sunshine developed tumors that turned to be cancerous. And just a short time later, she would cross the Rainbow Bridge and die at the age of 15. To those who believe, one could picture a happy puppy version of Missouri River Sunshine jumping into Morris's arms, finally reunited. But for Morris's family, it was the last of their living connection to Morris, and their grief was heavy. While continuing to investigate Morris's case, Detective John Cameron was also continuing to look into Suzette Pritchard's. And then he finally got a break. In 1997, Cameron received information from a confidential informant who claimed that Donald Dubray was responsible for the killing. At the time, Dubray was already serving time in prison for an unrelated rape conviction. The informant also told investigators that Dubray had owned older red Pontiacs, something that immediately caught detectives' attention because witnesses had described seeing a worn red vehicle leaving the area around the time of the murder. As detectives reopened the investigation, they discovered that Dubray had in fact been driving a red or maroon Pontiac with rear end damage in 1986, a detail that closely matched witness accounts from the night Suzette was killed. Investigators also tracked down Dubray's former girlfriend, Rose Valenzuela. She told jurors that Dubray had left their apartment on the night of the murder and did not return until the following morning. Even more damaging was her testimony that weeks later, after she moved to Seattle, Dubray had found her there and admitted that he robbed the town pump. Prosecutors argued that this confession, combined with the witness statements and vehicle evidence, helped place him at the center of the crime. He was charged with Suzette's murder. Before we get into that further, though, in the trial, I want to give a snapshot of Donnie Dubray's life and criminal history. And what I'm about to start with is far from his first run-in with the law, but for example, New Year's Day, 1985. A woman accuses Donnie Dubray of kidnapping her and forcing her into a van in the parking lot of a Browning, Montana motel bar and raping her in the van. Later that year, an 11-man, one-woman jury would find him not guilty. Then, just a few months later, in March of '86, he's arrested again. This time for raping a 15-year-old girl on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation on March 3rd. Because there were no witnesses to the March 3rd incident that year, the case largely fell apart. Dubray said they were all kind of drinking and they had sex, and he admitted that they had sex to Kenneth Morissette, who was from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But then his defense attorney suggested that Dubray was just bragging, and the case fell apart. The defense in the case tried to say that it was consensual, and then, of course, the prosecution was saying she's 15, so it doesn't really matter either way. But the jury wouldn't hear it, and he was acquitted again for the second time in 17 months. In 1986 alone, he was stopped multiple times by police and highway patrol officers, sometimes allegedly providing false names or false identifying information when he was questioned. After Suzette's murder, those encounters continued. He was arrested several times for driving-related offenses, including driving with a suspended license and operating an uninsured vehicle. While those charges were relatively minor, investigators would later view them as part of a much larger pattern. More concerning were allegations that surfaced at the end of 1986, going into '87. According to court records, on New Year's Eve, Dubray and another man were accused of breaking into a Great Falls home shortly after midnight. Prosecutors alleged that when the homeowner returned, she discovered Dubray standing over a woman with a pillow pressed over her face. Authorities claimed he had pulled the woman from a couch and attempted to sexually assault her. The case led to both state and federal charges, though many of those charges were ultimately dismissed as part of a plea agreement in federal court, including that attempted sexual assault charge. Over the next several years, Dubray's legal troubles continued. Records show arrests for burglary, possession of stolen property, and violations of a work release program in Washington state. At one point, he failed to return from a work crew assignment and was considered an escapee. He was repeatedly accused of using aliases, violating court orders, and ignoring the conditions of his release. Authorities also investigated him in connection with additional sexual assault allegations tied to incidents on the Blackfeet Reservation. His behavior would finally catch up with him, but not before another young girl was harmed. The case that ultimately landed Dubray in federal prison stemmed from an incident that prosecutors said occurred in September of '89 on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. According to court testimony, a 15-year-old girl was found wandering the streets of Browning at around 3 a.m. Prosecutors alleged that earlier in the evening she had gone to Dubray's home with several other people, where alcohol was consumed and cocaine was reportedly used. Assistant U.S. Attorney Carl Rostad told jurors that after all the others had passed out, Dubray allegedly forced the girl into a bedroom, blocked the door with a weight set, and sexually assaulted her. The girl later managed to leave the home and contact the Bureau of Indian Affairs police. Officers arrested Dubray after finding him hiding in a closet. Prosecutors also told the jury that Dubray later admitted to the assault while he was in jail. Medical evidence, including DNA testing, confirmed that sexual intercourse had occurred, and the government argued that the victim's injuries were consistent with a sexual assault. This was actually noted at the time to be Montana's first DNA-related conviction. Of course, Dubray's defense attorney did not dispute that the two had sex. Rather, he said that it was consensual. Jurors were told that the teenager had willingly gone to the home, drank alcohol, used drugs, and spent time with the group before the alleged assault. The trial also brought attention to Dubray's past. Jurors learned that he had previously been acquitted in 2 separate rape cases, one involving an adult woman in 1984 and another involving a 15-year-old girl in 1986. At the time of the trial, Dubray was also facing federal charges alleging that he assaulted a Bureau of Indian Affairs officer and illegally possessed a firearm as a convicted felon. Unlike the earlier cases, this time prosecutors secured a conviction. Dubray was sentenced to federal prison for 27 years, and he was 27 years old at the time. Heading into the trial for Suzette Pritchard, it was pretty controversial. Donnie Dubray vocally spoke of his innocence and said he had a lot of people backing him, even doing huge letter-writing campaigns attesting to his character. They were saying things like, he can get himself into trouble, but not like that. He'd steal a car, but never murder anybody. A woman named Mary Calf-Looking, who was a Browning resident who helped look after Dubray as a child and some of his siblings, she said, quote, "He was a wonderful kid. He was never a troublesome boy. He wasn't a runaround type. He listened good. He'd go to school. He'd always come home on time. He never would steal, even early on." Dubray spoke out vocally to the media, saying, quote, "I did not kill this woman." He claimed he had 2 black eyes at the time from a fight and said, had he been the one at the store, surely the witnesses would have noticed that. He also claimed to have an alibi, that he was hanging with his cousin and her husband. They do go along with this alibi, but their timelines don't exactly match up. I just want to say here that I truly do believe the people who had good experiences with him, I'm sure they did, and that he did have his positive moments. But statistically speaking, we have to acknowledge the fact that before his arrest in this case, he was convicted of 6 felonies and 100 misdemeanors. That's insane. In January of 1999, the trial began. Testimony took 3 weeks, and in February of 1999, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury found Donnie Dubray guilty of Suzette Pritchard's homicide. He was sentenced to life in prison plus additional sentencing for the robbery. So I know what you are thinking. What does this have to do with Morris Davis Jr.? Is he thought to be a suspect in that case? And the answer is yes. Sergeant John Cameron named him as a likely suspect. According to various sources, Cameron kept in touch with Dubray while he was in prison, and Cliff Davis tried to speak to him as well. I couldn't officially confirm all the details of this, but from what has repeatedly been shared online and in some news articles, Dubray knew certain things about the layout of the vacant house and the angle the shooter would have been in, and he didn't even deny being there, but did deny being the shooter. Based on a 2026 interview that the local news did with retired Sergeant John Cameron, he stated it's his belief that others know what happened that night. And some speculation ties back to some of the crowd Dubray was running with. For example, his stepfather, who was actually the same age as him but was considered the common-law husband of his mother. He and Dubray were close in the 80s, and he was arrested and charged with a murder that occurred just 3 weeks after Morris Davis Jr.'s murder, and it occurred on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. He is actually still in prison for that crime. Initially, the person who turned the stepfather in for that crime also implicated Donnie Dubray, but when it came time to testify at trial, he switched up the story and left Donnie Dubray out of it. Nobody knows for sure if these men or Donnie Dubray had anything to do with Morris Davis Jr.'s murder, but it should be noted that detectives listened in on Donnie Dubray's jailhouse conversations for over 2 years while he was in prison, and he allegedly, on multiple occasions, tried to arrange alibis for himself at the time of different crimes, including one that aligned with the details and timelines of Morris Davis Jr. If Dubray was involved in this case, he can't answer for it now. After his federal rape charge sentence was up, he transferred to prison in Montana in 2014 to begin serving time for Suzette's murder. He then died at age 55 in prison in 2016. Detectives are still trying to determine if he had anything to do with Morris's case. If so, did he act alone, and who else might have information? In a 2026 interview with the local news about the anniversary of this case, retired detective Sergeant John Cameron suggested that those working the case now should lean back into the physical evidence. He remembered that Morris's clothes from the night should still be in evidence, and that whoever dragged him back into the house would have had to touch the collar of his shirt. So with all that in mind, there may still be opportunity in this case for DNA advancements to solve it. But in the meantime, it's never too late to come forward with information. His father sadly passed away in 2024, but his mother and brother are still alive and hoping for answers. Delnita still lives in the house she raised her boys in, and she has devoted her life to being a victim's advocate and helping families going through difficult times. She also would meet with inmates about to be released from prison to better help them understand the family impact. She is long overdue for some support of her own. If you have any information on the unsolved murder of Morris Davis Jr. in Great Falls, Montana in 1986, please call Detective Patrick Levitt at the Great Falls Police Department. His phone number is 406-455-8509. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing on this podcast, please leave me a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen. If you're leaving one on Apple, taking a moment to write a written review is really helpful. Also, if you're over on Reddit, dropping my podcast name when people are looking for recommendations has actually been how so many of you have found me, so keep that up, it really helps. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Thank you so much as always for listening, and join me again next Monday.